Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, everyone. Welcome to Parliament House, a Parliament House which is situated on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional owners of this country. This is a special place, and so we acknowledge that each day we acknowledge our elders, past and present. Can I also acknowledge Jackie and thank her for her leadership in this incredibly important portfolio? It's so important. I was once, talking to an elder statesperson of the Parliament. This gentleman was the Minister for this, the Minister for that, the Minister for Mines, a very senior member of the Cabinet. And he said to me, and it's not on my team, the other team, by the way, and he said to me, the portfolio I'm scared of most. And I'm thinking, well, he's the Mines Minister, right? So big mines, scary numbers, scale. He says, fisheries. The fisheries is the one that you can stuff up the easiest, a single decision, a wrong misstep, and you can really damage a fish stock or eliminate it altogether. And so he considered it the most important job he had of all the senior portfolios that he held on to. And I want to thank Jackie for taking on the mantle of this incredibly important portfolio. Can I also acknowledge Kiralee Ward, the shadow spokesperson for Fisheries, and member for Geraldton's, Sophie McNeil, member of the Legislative Council, Amanda Dawn, member of the Legislative Council. So Kiralee's from the Nationals, Sophie's from the Greens, Amanda from the Animal Justice Party, Phil Scott, member of the Legislative Council for One Nation. And can I also just take the opportunity to acknowledge a couple of former colleagues who are here, Carol Martin and Matt Taylor. Great to see you both. Can I just also acknowledge you, all distinguished guests. This is an important gathering. It's a gathering which is about pulling together the best minds, the experts and the people with the stakeholders in this crucial area. And having you all here is a very important opportunity for my government. While we're here to talk about the science of fishing and particularly the demersal fish stocks, I recognise there's much more about it than that, just that. We're talking about livelihoods, we're talking about how we spend our time, we're talking about our biodiversity, we're talking about what we are handing on to our kids and our grandkids and the people of the future generations of Western Australians. But before any of that, what we need to do is to have a collective understanding of where we're at in 2025. And the research that we'll review today will provide a crucial snapshot of our fish stocks along our coast. Look, the data is the data, right? But it does come with, it does not have opinions and it cannot decide the next steps. That's up to you. That's the responsibility of each and every one of us today. But I think we can all agree that the ultimate goal here is to ensure that our demersal scale fish species are around for future Western Australians. Our grandkids, our kids, future West Aussies. So before I hand back to the facilitator, I just want to acknowledge that many of you have been part of the efforts to recover the demersal stocks over the last 15 years. Recreational, commercial and charter fishers have complied with the rule changes that have been implemented. And while we haven't seen the sort of recovery that we had hoped for, I want to thank you everyone for your efforts to date. And today we have to try again. Today we have to come together as one, deciding how we collectively will move forward to protect this incredibly important part of our biodiversity, an incredibly important part of our economy, an incredibly important part of our way of life. So as I alluded to before, today's not about making decisions, but today is about sharing what the latest research shows about the WA fish that we love, like pink snapper, red emperor and the iconic WA jewfish, which is only found here in Western Australia. Naturally, the science has to inform any future steps, but so do people whose lives and livelihoods are involved in fishing along our incredible coast. Many important decisions and discussions have to be had in this place, and in that way, I encourage you all to share your views. Make sure that you and the people that you represent are heard in today's forum. And commit everyone, please, to working together to make the right decisions for the future. So please listen and engage with an open mind, engage with an open heart, and engage with the thought of future generations of Western Australians, foremost in your thinking. But once again, thank you very much for coming. I wish you all the very best for your deliberations. Cheers.
Thank you everyone for coming along today and good morning. So today I'll give you a fairly high level overview of the recent stock assessments that were completed for the various demersal resources around the state. First of all, I'd just like to give you a little bit of background on how we do things, how we undertake these various stock assessments. So as you would know, obviously there are many different fish species around our state, and among those, over 100 species are caught by various fisheries around the state across our various bioregions. So it's challenging to monitor and do high-level stock assessments of all these different species. So we adopt what we call an indicator species approach, where we focus on a selected number of species. These species are selected based on things like their vulnerability to the effects of fishing. So for example, a lot of the demersal species are quite long-lived. They might be late maturing, they might be slow growing, some of them aggregate to spawn, some of them change sex, and all these biological characteristics can make them vulnerable to fishing. There are also obviously some of the key species in our fisheries around the state. We're talking about pink snapper and jewfish and red emperor and a range of other species. And as a result of that and the effects of fishing on these stocks, they also pose a risk to the department in terms of its management of fisheries. So we use these indicator species to represent the demersal suite, the whole range of demersal species in each of our bioregions. And from those species, we are adopting what's called a precautionary approach to the management of our fisheries. So the species that are at the highest risk of further depletion under current fishing are used to dictate what might happen in a management sense. Our stock assessments themselves comprise a whole range of analyses, from fairly simple level 1 type analyses, which are analysis of catch information that we might receive. And we look at that information against various benchmarks, for example, in the West Coast demersal resource, where we're monitoring the recovery of that resource, or against total allowable catches, for example, in the Gascoyne snapper oceanic stock. We can look at level 2 type analyses, which is our fishery dependent data, and we're looking at things like catch per unit effort there, which is often used as an index of abundance of stocks. We can look at level 3 analyses, which are demographic information. These are our length and age distributions that we obtain through fishery dependent or independent sources. And from those we can conduct various types of analyses to understand what might be happening in our stocks. That's currently the highest level of assessment we can undertake for our South Coast demersal resource, while we have a relatively limited time series of biological information. A level 4 type analyses are derived from fishery independent surveys. So where we undertake fishery independent surveys in certain circumstances, we can use that information to produce measures of abundance of stocks or biological information, for example. And then we have our level 5 integrated population models. These are the most complex models that we produce, and they comprise information from all of these different levels of analyses. And we undertake these in each of the Kimberley, Pilbara, Gascoyne and also West Coast bioregions at present. So simply, a fish population can increase in biomass as a function of recruitment. So every year we have spawning that happens, new recruits join the resource, so your new juveniles join the population, and over time those fish will grow, and fish that are already in the population also grow. So that's contributing to an increase in biomass. At the same time, we have declining biomass as a function of natural mortality, so that's obviously things like old age or disease or predation or those sorts of factors. And on top of that, we have fishing mortality, which is obviously the thing that we need to ensure we have at sustainable levels to make sure our stocks remain sustainable also. So our fishing mortality is essentially catch information. So catch and post-release mortality, where release rates might be high, for example, and release mortality is an issue. And that's the measure that we are trying to maintain at appropriate levels to ensure we have sustainable stocks. If we see declines in the number of older fish in a population of these long-lived demersal species, it can usually indicate that there might be declines in your actual breeding biomass, so there's less of these older fish in the population. And they're pretty important for replenishment of fish populations because they can produce a lot of eggs, and they're important for during the spawning period. If we ensure that the composition of that age distribution is appropriate, then we should be able to maintain our stocks at sustainable levels, which is above that 40% of unfished biomass. If we start to fall below 30% of unfished biomass, or even 20% of unfished biomass, then we were getting to unsustainable levels. And that's where we need to be considering what we do to recover those stocks. So once we fall below that threshold reference point, which is 30% of unfished biomass, we're heading into a high risk of further depletion if your fishing mortality continues at its current rate. If we fall below 20% of relative biomass, unfished biomass, then we're actually at severe risk of further depletion if that fishing mortality continues there. So I'll run through just some of the recent outcomes of the various assessments around the bioregions. Firstly, starting in the Kimberley. So the recent assessment completed undertook analyses of both red emperor and gold-band snapper as indicator species for this resource. And basically over time, what you see on the left graphs there is for red emperor, at least in the last 20 years, catches have been relatively stable. They've been bouncing around a little bit, but relatively stable. Whereas for gold-band snapper, they've actually been increasing quite dramatically. But in both cases, those catch levels have actually been leading to declines in the biomass of these species. So by 2024, the relative biomass of red emperor had fallen to below that threshold reference point, so that 30% of unfished biomass. And basically what that's saying is that catches at that level are actually driving that biomass down. So if that fishing mortality or catch continues at that level, then we will see continued decline in that biomass. Similarly for gold-band, although the stock at the moment in 2024 is at a higher level than red emperor, the recent catch trends have been driving a decline in biomass down towards and just below the target reference point. So based on the indicator approach and the precautionary approach that we use, the stocks in the Kimberley are currently at high risk of further depletion, and that's based on your highest risk indicator species there, the red emperor. For the Pilbara demersal resource, an assessment was completed at the end of 2023, and that demonstrated that for red emperor in particular, that stocks had reached the limit reference point. And by 2023, it had actually fallen below the limit reference point, so below 20% of unfished biomass. So those stocks were therefore at severe risk of further depletion if fishing mortality continued that level. And you can see by the graph on the left there that catches in recent times have been very high in comparison to previous times. So a management response was instigated to recover these stocks over a 20-year period, and that comprises reductions in entitlement to commercial fishing to reduce effort in the fishery, and therefore reduce commercial catch by 25% in the first phase, and in a second phase by a full 38% to achieve that recovery over 20 years. For the Gascoyne demersal scalefish resource, and this is the oceanic snapper stock, so outside of Shark Bay, an assessment was completed in 2017, and that demonstrated that at the time, the stock of snapper had reached below the limit reference point, so below 20% of unfished biomass. So it was at severe risk of further depletion at that level of fishing mortality at the time. So a recovery plan was instigated in 2018, where in particular a total allowable catch was introduced to limit the commercial catch of snapper to no more than 51 tonnes. And over the last few years, the relative biomass of snapper has been increasing dramatically. It is partially driven by strong recruitment in the population from around 2015 and 2016, but is actually recovering quite rapidly. And so by 2021, we'd increased to above the limit reference point, so above 20% of unfished biomass. By 2024, we'd increased to above 30% of unfished biomass, so we're back above the threshold reference point. So essentially on track to reach the target reference point by the end of the recovery period in 2037. As a function of that, we looked at some projections of future relative biomass trends based on if we increase catch in the fishery, would it actually prevent the stock from recovering? And we found basically that a 45 tonne increase in the commercial catch wouldn't prevent the stock from recovering by the end of the 20-year period. So a 45 tonne increase was allowed into the total allowable catch for snapper in the Gascoyne. So at present, that stock is at medium risk of further depletion, but is well on its way to recovering towards the target reference point. For the West Coast demersal resource, as we most know, that this resource has been in recovery for over 15 years now. One of the objectives of that recovery over a 20-year period was to maintain catches below what we call our benchmark catches. There's effectively a limit on catch. So they are the dashed lines that you can see on each of these graphs. And in various points in time, catches have exceeded those benchmarks, and in other periods of time, they've actually been below those benchmarks. So we can see, for example, pink snapper catches reaching above the benchmark in the early years for the commercial catch, driven by strong recruitment in the population, and for the recreational catch being above that dotted line, that benchmark, for the whole time in that recovery period. For jewfish, over time the commercial catch has been below the recovery benchmark for the commercial sector, and in some years has exceeded the benchmark in the recreational sector. Another assessment was completed in 2021, which demonstrated that those stocks were still not recovering. They were still around or below the limit reference point, in other words, around or below 20% of unfished biomass. So at the level of fishing mortality that was happening on the stock at the time, those stocks were not going to actually continue to recover. So significant changes were made to the management of these fisheries to try and ensure that the stocks would recover. So to bring the total catch down from each of the sectors to ensure we reduce fishing mortality and let that biomass start increasing. In most cases, though, since 2023, catches have been well above, at least at or well above those new benchmarks. So what effect has that been having on the various stocks? So the assessments here focus on snapper and West Australian jewfish as the key indicator species for the resource. And the snapper stock is divided into two, basically. From around Lancelin northwards, there's a separate genetic stock to Lancelin southwards, based on some recent genetic analysis that's been conducted. And so what you see basically over time is that while catch had increased for a few years just after the management changes were made, which was driven by a strong recruitment, a single year of strong recruitment in the population, we had to bring effort down in the commercial sector. This is in the northern part of the West Coast, which is the Midwest and Kalbarri areas. We had to bring effort down in the fishery to ensure that catches remain below the benchmark. What had happened, though, over several years is that single strong year class had been fished down quite rapidly. So despite the fact that catch rates and catches were going up and things looked good, the actual biological characteristics of the species were not recovering. So the age composition was not recovering, and under that higher level of fishing mortality was not going to increase in terms of biomass. So after the management changes were made, the catches were brought down. Obviously, by that point in time, that single strong year class had already been reduced in abundance. So catches were quite low, and reports were that it was less economically viable to fish at the time. In 2015 and 16, there's been some good recruitment to the population, and what we've seen then in subsequent years is catches starting to increase over time, such that after the recent management changes were made, those catches have been exceeding the new benchmarks that were introduced. So unfortunately, that means that at the current state, that the fishing mortality in the population is too high, and it's limiting the actual biomass from recovering. So by 2024, we can see the spawning biomass on the bottom plot there. That biomass is still below the limit reference point, so it's below your 20% of unfished biomass. You obviously can see an increasing trend in that biomass in the last few years, and that's driven by the strong recruitment in the population, and that's a good thing. We want that. That's what we need to happen. But unfortunately, with fishing mortality at those higher levels, well above the new benchmarks, that biomass trend will probably stop going upwards and it will start to fall. So it's critically important that fishing mortality is at the right level so that those year classes can actually survive for long enough and ensure that they actually help to replenish the population, and then it becomes more self-sustaining. If we move to the southern part of the West Coast, what happened here after the management changes were made that were completed by 2010 was that obviously we had substantial decreases in catch. The metropolitan area was closed to commercial line fishing for demersal species, and there were significant changes to the recreational rules, as many people know. Since that point in time, though, the catches have been increasing and exceeded the benchmark several years ago. And in 2023, after the recent changes to management, those catches are still well above the actual new benchmark. So what's happening there after those management changes were made is that relative biomass is just hovering around the limit reference point. So it's around about 20% of unfished biomass, and it's not increasing at the current level of fishing mortality. For WA jewfish, similarly for snapper, in the metropolitan area, we had the closures to commercial fishing for for demersal species, including jewfish, and all of the changes to recreational rules. And catches and release mortality on top of that were below those benchmarks in those first few years. Since the management changes occurred, they've actually been slightly above those benchmarks. Over that entire period of time, though, since the late 2000s, that relative biomass has remained below the limit reference point, so below 20% of unfished biomass. So what that's actually saying is that those benchmarks were definitely way too high. It was never going to recover under those catches, even if we achieved them. In recent years as well, we've also had relatively low recruitment, so there's only a couple of good strong year classes in the population. They dominate both recreational and commercial catch right across the metropolitan and southern part of the west coast. They're important, but we need to make sure that the fishing mortality remains low enough so that they survive and continue to replenish the population. For the south coast, as I mentioned, we do what we call level 3 type analysis, slightly different modelling approach to understanding relative biomass of our fish populations. But for snapper, bite redfish and also blue groper, the relative biomass of those three species has fallen below the threshold reference point, and it's between the threshold and limit reference point, so lower than 30% unfished biomass, but just above 20%. We've also seen other characteristics which indicate the effects of fishing on the population, which are things like a reduction in mean length of these species, particularly bite redfish, and also truncation in the age distributions, which basically means a loss of some of those older fish since the previous stock assessment was completed. So what that's saying, and I've just got the example of snapper here, is that those catch levels at that point in time and over the last 10 or so years have been too high. They've contributed to a decline in the relative biomass in those species. So we're currently at high risk of further depletion if fishing mortality continues at that level in the south coast. In terms of our stock assessment modelling approaches, these have recently been independently reviewed. So in 2024, independent reviews were conducted by Professor Andre Punt. He's a world recognised stock assessment scientist, stock assessment modeller, and he's been over to Western Australia. Well, he works at the University of Washington, but also comes and works with CSIRO. He's been over to WA in the last couple of years and independently reviewed our various modelling approaches. So the key component of that was that we are wanting to move our models from being bespoke in-house models that we construct ourselves, coding, all of those sorts of things that mathematicians and statisticians do. We're moving those into what's called stock synthesis. It's a widely used framework around the globe. It means that what we're doing is more consistent, well, it's consistent with all of the other stock assessment scientists and their work around the world. And also that there is transparency in the approaches. A great thing about these stock synthesis models is they're much more flexible, so you can bring in a whole range of data sets and new time series of information into the model, so you're not just focused on 2 or 3 different particular data sets that we might have used in the past, for example. So lots of different complementary approaches can be used. So the review that Andre undertook was basically to have a look at how we construct our models, the data sets being used and the statistical assumptions that go into those models. And through that review process, he basically confirmed the validity of the models that we're undertaking and using, and therefore the assessment outcomes. So overall, just to summarise, basically what we're seeing with the various stock assessments that have been undertaken around the state is that we have high to severe risk around a large part of our state, from the Kimberley to the Pilbara to the west coast and the south coast. In contrast, in the Gascoyne, we're seeing substantial recovery of the Gascoyne oceanic snapper stock. And that's due to the fact that we're able to constrain catches to a manageable limit. So under a total allowable catch framework, we're actually being able to constrain catches and it can't get above that TAC. And that's really the major contributing factor to allowing those stocks to recover. But what it's saying for the other bioregions and the other demersal resources is that we need to consider alternatives in how we go about managing those resources. We need to recover each of these resources. That's a clear objective that's required now. So perhaps some of the approaches that we use need to actually change. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to start out at the beginning. I know we reflected on some of the collaboration in the beginning and the sort of the power of collaboration. Right at the outset, I'd like to say, look, this has been a journey for me as much as it's been for many people in the room that involved in fisheries management. for over 30 years, and certainly been involved with demersal scalefish management through that last 20-year period. And in what have I learnt from that journey, and this is really a journey that we're on, this is a point in time and that journey will continue. And I will say this, that when it comes to collaboration and it comes to people, the most important aspect that I see from a fisheries management perspective going into today, and actually what happens tomorrow and the weeks after and the months after and the years after, is the importance of relationships and actually working together. It's something that, the fish look after themselves, we actually manage people. We manage people, we manage people's behaviour, and that has an impact on, it has an impact on jobs, has an impact on the economics of fishery, but also has an impact on the social amenity and the values as far as people accessing the resource for Western Australia. So that capacity to move forward in this environment with so many different shared stakeholders is about people, it's about understanding people, and it's about working together. So I'd just like to say that at the beginning that, I understand as a fisheries manager, my job is actually about managing relationships, and it's about investing in those relationships, and that's clearly understood from DPIRD's capacity and point of view. Whether it's science or management, we have to work with the stakeholders, we have to work with you in the future. It doesn't matter whether it's this fishery, it doesn't matter if it's rock lobster, it doesn't matter if it's on the south coast dealing with estuaries or other things like that. Relationships are important, and they underpin fisheries management as we move forward. So I'll just today, whoops, wrong way. Right. Today you've got the science presentation. My presentation is to give you a bit of an overview of fisheries management from around Western Australia and a little bit of a focus on the West Coast as well. And that will really set you up with having an understanding of fisheries management and the research to really move into those discussions later on today to look at how we actually move forward with demersal scalefish management for around Western Australia. It's important to understand that when you actually look at, Dave talked about the fact that we've got different species in different regions and looked at the indicator approach to managing both recreational and commercial fishing as far as getting an understanding of the science and the stock assessment. But in Western Australia, we have all of our fisheries under formal management. So we don't have areas of open access, if you like, that are not regulated in that way. So all of our commercial fisheries are limited entry. There are varying types of models that have been applied to the different regions to manage commercial fishing in different ways. Some of them are line fisheries, some of them are trap fisheries, some of them are trawl, which I'll talk about. But certainly we've got that management framework in place that allows us to actually take decisions and actually deal with the commercial sector and restrict catches moving forward. With recreational fishing, a little bit different in that we manage that not through commercial management plans, we manage that via regulation and notices, things like bag limits, boat limits, size limits. Size limits can have application to both commercial and recreational fishers, but a different approach to managing recreational fishing via regulations. We've also got the use of harvest strategies. Some of you may understand what a harvest strategy is, some of you that are outside the fishing environment may not. They're really the governance document that sets out those decision rules about what you should be doing when the stock gets to a particular state. So we talked about being above the target, when you look at moving below the target towards a threshold, taking action to reduce catches, and then when you move below the threshold, taking harder action, and then when you get down to the limit, which is really that 20%, left in the water, the spawning biomass, then you're really hardwiring in some recovery plans for the fishery and looking at 50 to 100% reductions in catches. Those are not easy decisions to make, and they are something that we work with those different sectors on how we actually try and achieve that. But those harvest strategies are very important in actually delivering that framework for how we actually manage our fisheries, both commercial and recreational. We've got stock assessments. Dave's already talked about those. We have ongoing monitoring. We have dependent and independent data coming in on our catches. If you look at what's dependent and what's independent, we can have a reliance on what the recreational and the commercial sector provide in frames, and we do that age sampling off those frames. That's fishery dependent data. We can also look at independent data where we'll go out and contract vessels, do trapping or other things like that, which is outside that fishery, to actually get independent sampling as well. Who fishes where? And it's quite an interesting picture when you look at the state and looking at the catch. In the Kimberley and the Pilbara, certainly we see an area which is dominated by commercial catches, but also recognising that some of those key population areas, in the Kimberley and the Pilbara are also very important for recreational fishing and tourism. And a lot of people who live in the Pilbara place a huge value on the capacity to access the marine environment and go fishing. If you look at the number of licences that we have, this is just recreational boat licences by home postcode, if you like, not where they're travelling to, but you can see that there is a probably more limited number of boat or licences in the Pilbara and the Kimberley. Pilbara has some of the highest boat ownership and rec licences per capita anywhere in the state. But the heart of the commercial fishery for the state, if you like, in actually looking at the supply of fresh seafood to Western Australia and also to the eastern states, a lot of that is coming out of the Pilbara and the Kimberley. When you move to the Gascoyne, it's a bit more of a split, but it's still dominated by commercial fishing, 61%. But we're seeing then the importance, obviously, of a significant number of charter operators that operate in the Gascoyne. West Coast is really much more of a split, and we've got over 100,000 recreational boat fishing licences which are issued in the West Coast region. When you actually look at that 100,000 boat fishing licences and you think, well, okay, what does that actually translate to people that go fishing for demersal scalefish? So through some of our sampling work, we look at probably about 60,000 West Australians of that 100,000 actually participate in recreational fishing for demersal scalefish. Others may be fishing in the estuaries for crabs and other bits and pieces, or fishing for nearshore species like whiting and squid. But we've got about 60,000 recreational fishers in that West Coast bioregion. South Coast, again, dominated by commercial fishing, less recreational fishing effort that's occurring. And with that particular fishery on the South Coast, we have brought the commercial fishery under management. So we've done what we call the access bit. So we actually know who the commercial operators are that can operate in that, but we're yet to do the allocation. So we haven't issued quota or time type entitlement within the South Coast. That's a challenge moving forward. How are they managed? As I said, the commercial fisheries, if we look at the north of the state, we've got trap, line and trawl fisheries. And all the commercial fisheries that we've got, with the exception of the Gascoyne region and the South Coast, which we're yet to do the allocation, is really relying on time, effort. So we actually control the amount of time that the actual commercial fishers can actually spend on the water. And that involves setting often different types of catch entitlement for different areas and trying to work that back to time on the water. And the exception is the Gascoyne, where we have a quota-based fishery, which is kilos effectively for pink snapper and non-pink snapper species. And that's really been, I think, the success story for us to actually manage that fishery in a more explicit way and ensure that it's actually achieving recovery. For recreational fishing, we have bag limits, size limits that apply on a statewide basis. We also have seasonal effort controls on the West Coast. And we have boat limits and other things like that. I will say that when it comes to recreational fishing, there are real challenges in recreational fisheries management where you don't necessarily control the number of people who are fishing in the fishery or how often they may be fishing during that open period. And we've relied on, in the West Coast, trying to use a primary type of measure to restrict that catch, and that's been a reliance on the seasonal closure, which is at the moment 5.5 months. And we relied then on changing bag and size limits, which deliver some catch savings. But when it comes to recreational fishing, if you are going to genuinely reduce the catch, you have to have some primary measure that can actually deliver the bulk of those catch savings. The only other fishery that I think was where we really successfully managed recreational fishing to an explicit catch limit was in the Gascoyne in Shark Bay. For a period of time we used tags and had a tag allocation process around issuing tags to people. They entered into a lottery and we were able to manage the catch to an explicit level there. a lot more easy in a Gascoyne setting where you had snapper, shallow water, single species fishery. When it comes to the West Coast, you're managing a multi-species fishery, whether it's jewfish, whether it's pink snapper, bald-chin groper, breaksea cod. There are real challenges associated with managing a mixed multi-species fishery, and you can't necessarily separate out one species like jewfish and just say, well, okay, say for example, some people might say, well, okay, jewfish is so bad as far as the stock is concerned, why don't you just have a closure to jewfish? And then you say, well, okay, people will then go out and say, well, we can't take jewfish, but we'll fish for snapper and we'll fish for bald-chin groper and other species. And they'll catch jewfish and they'll put them back into the water. And then there can be issues with barotrauma, and then there's a fishing mortality associated with that. So having a multi-species approach does require some consideration of those species that actually make up the catch, both for commercial and recreational fishers. Charter, similar, we've got bag boat limits, and we also have a tag system. Again, that tag system worked very well in the West Coast to manage the charter sector to an explicit catch limit. We've also got spawning closures in some areas, in the West Coast and the Gascoyne. I think that in particular for species like pink snapper, where we understand where they're aggregating and where they can spawn, then that provides us with that capacity to actually put in place very effective seasonal closures, spawning closures, to actually protect those fish when they are most vulnerable. For some other species like jewfish, it's a bit more difficult. They'll spawn over a long period of time. They won't form the same sort of aggregations that pink snapper form. So trying to look at spawning closures, we understand when they spawn, but their behaviour is quite different to species like pink snapper. Just a bit of a timeline on the West Coast demersal scalefish resource management. And this is, again, a lived experience for me, and I've been there all the way along. Back in 2007 to 10, we really started to bring the fishery under management. We brought in place the commercial management plan, which also included the metro closure to commercial fishing. So metro Lancelin to south of Mandurah is managed just as a recreational fishing zone. We had a 2-month seasonal closure that was brought in place. And then that was even a contentious issue back in 2010, where we had, politics does play a role. You rely on the support of government to put in place these decisions. We had a particular party that was in at the time that was recommending a 4-month seasonal closure. It became a political issue. We ended up with a 2-month seasonal closure and a range of other measures that were pulled to try and reduce bag limits and boat limits to offset that less, the closed period. We've had periods of effort reduction through the mid-2000s, 2014, 2017, and then when we had the more comprehensive stock assessment back in 21-23, we introduced additional restrictions on commercial fishing as far as reducing their time on the water. We had a buyout of commercial effort as well, and we had a 5.5-month closure and the introduction of that tag system that I was talking about for the charter sector. If you look at just what happened or what would happen, where we've got, the jewfish currently well below or below the limit reference point of 20%. And if you understand and you think, well, okay, what does that mean from across the West Coast bioregion? It's about 15% spawning biomass. That's the level that we're at jewfish. But in the metropolitan area, Mandurah to south of Mandurah to Lancelin, the stock would indicate that it's actually about 7%. So about 7% for jewfish, 15% across the board. If back in 2010 we'd actually shut the fishery and actually said, okay, this is just jewfish, but it's really effectively if you had a closure and not actually allowing the take of any jewfish, today we would be back above the target reference point of 40%. But it shows you that you need that's a 10-year period. It's a 10-year period without any fishing that you would actually recover that fishery. And it shows you that when you look at these sorts of species which are long-lived, slow-growing, and also have variable recruitment. You don't get recruitment, that's juvenile fish coming into the fishery each year at the same level. With jewfish, it may be decadal that we get a really good recruitment. Pink snapper might be a little bit more, it might be every few years, but certainly not every year that you get that recruitment into the fishery. But it shows you that you need a long-term approach to actually fully recovering these fisheries. The other thing which is important is that, when in 2023 the government introduced new measures, that was also supported, recognising the importance of the West Coast bioregion, particularly to the recreational and the charter sector. The government supported it with a $10 million recovery support package. As I said, there was targeted buyouts that were voluntary for the commercial sector, so those people who may wanted to surrender their entitlement to leave the industry, they could so choose to. That was resulted in around 30 odd tonnes of demersal scale fish being then made available to charter and recreational fisheries. We introduced the digital catch reporting, so there is now an app. It's not compulsory, it's on a voluntary basis that people can record their demersal scale fish catches. We had some enhanced monitoring and research, people at the boat ramps looking at better catch estimates and validating some of the weights of the different species, and that was important when we looked at changing the management arrangements, like moving away from size limits for some of the key species. What did that actually mean for the average weight of fish being landed? Enhanced education, we had a snapper stock enhancement program. The stock enhancement program, it's important to recognise that was not about actually trying to rebuild the stock. With that sort of level of restocking, it was more about trying to promote that sense of stewardship, personal responsibility and connection to the resource. By getting people involved in that restocking, getting them down to the marinas or down to Coburn Sound and actually putting fish back in the water is quite a powerful thing to do, to actually make sure that the community is actually connected to what you're actually trying to achieve. And we also had a charter diversification scheme, so grants and other things like that to help the charter industry move away from demersal scale fish towards targeting other types of species or doing different types of charters. How am I going for time?
You're going very well.
Good. Okay. Just a little bit of a case study comparing the Gascoyne versus West Coast snapper. This is in the north, in that Kalbarri area. So it's important to note that we've, in a similar situation, probably in 2017-18, where we had both the snapper resources in the Gascoyne and that Kalbarri zone being determined at a severe risk. So what do we do about it? In the Gascoyne, with the quota system in place, we could deliver really significant reduction in catches, also introduce some spawning closures. In the northwest coast, in regard to that Kalbarri zone, we had that effort reduction. We also had some reductions further with hours 23, 24, 25, really chasing it down. We had that rec package in 23 as well. But then when you actually look at what happened when you had those two different approaches to fishing, and despite what we did with those effort reductions, we saw an increase in catches in that northwest coast bioregion out of Kalbarri. The Gascoyne, with the quota setting being quite significant and restricting the commercial sector in that area, then the catches were kept at that low level. And you can see with the spawning biomass, the change in result, where the Gascoyne is on a trajectory to achieve that target level in the near future, whereas the West Coast area is still below the limit as a consequence of those measures not being as effective as the Gascoyne. When it comes to the harvest strategy guidance, and we talked about high, severe, medium risk, just so everyone, I know that Dave talked about it a little bit, but when we talk about severe risk, that's when we're at the limit, okay? So that's when we've got 20% or below of the spawning biomass in the water. When we're at high risk, we're in that zone between, we've breached the threshold, but we haven't breached the limit. And then you move above, the target zone, and that's when everything's going well. The Gascoyne's the only one there medium because it still hasn't achieved that target, but it's tracking that way and it's above the threshold. So high risk, we've breached the threshold. Severe risk, we're down below or at that 20% spawning biomass. So the current harvest strategy approach, what do you do? When your stock is at that level. So when you're at a high risk, you're looking at a 10 to 50% reduction. Severe risk, when you breach that limit, normally we, under the harvest strategy, would adopt a 50 to 100% reduction. And I think it's fair to say that when we've had this approach before in the past, it's been really trying to work towards that 50% reduction. There hasn't been an appetite to really go harder and actually deliver those significant reductions in that severe risk rating. When you look at, say, for example, Andre Punt, who's come out and done some work with us to review our stock assessments, and one of the most well-regarded modelers in the world out of Washington, their approach in the US, once you get 20%, that is it, you shut the fishery. Okay, that is it. There's no argument about it. Once you breach that limit, that's it, the fishery is shut. Challenges, I think when you look at the learned experience that certainly I've been through, the harvest strategy control rules, we haven't adopted a conservative enough approach to actually managing our fisheries as we get those signals that the fishery is tracking down. That we need to take a harder, more conservative approach to both commercial and recreational fishery management to ensure that we don't see those fisheries going from the target down to the threshold and down to the limit. And I think that when you look at the approach, we work with the sectors and we try and do the right thing, and as was said earlier, all the recreational and the commercial fishers have done the right thing. They've abided by the rules, and most fishers, whether they're commercial or recreational, have a strong sense of stewardship for the resource. It underpins their businesses at the end of the day. They want to keep operating, they want to continue to be in business. Recreational fishers, value the resource, value the experience, and they've done the right thing. Our fisheries officers that are out there on the boat ramps and other things, or interviewing commercial fishers, there is a high level of compliance with our recreational fishing rules because people have that sense of stewardship. But what we've learnt is that some of those rules that were put in place haven't been conservative enough as the fishery has shown signs of overfishing. It's fair to say, I think, that the effort-based management system we have in place for a number of the commercial fisheries has not achieved the outcomes that we would like to see as far as managing to explicit catch levels. And I think that from our approach, looking at the appropriateness of quota, there is some advantages, not just in actually having more effective control of the commercial catch setting, but a quota can also actually provide greater security for commercial operators, greater commercial access security if they have that quota. It's set at a particular level. I think if you look at the experience of Western rock lobster and having a individual transferable quota based system, that's linked certainly to that access right and strength of that access right. All sectors need to play their part. That's about fisheries management, as I said right at the beginning, that we all have to work together. Relationships in this space are really important, and that doesn't change. And I think that it's also worthwhile noting from a fisheries management point of view the timeliness of catch reporting. When it comes to the stock assessments, and we're looking at the biological data, we do that every 5 years to see what's happening with the age structure of the population. With commercial sector and the charter, we're getting basically trip reporting, acquitting of the tags. With the recreational sector, we're normally getting a catch estimate about every 3 years from the eye survey, which is based on that analysis of the recreational fishing from boat licence. That does present some challenges for us if we're only going to get a recreational catch estimate every 3 years when we're managing a fishery which is under significant sustainability issues. So they're some of the challenges moving forward. As I said, I hope that just gives you an oversight of the fisheries management that complements the research. I think that in Western Australia, we are actually really fortunate that we have a dedicated fisheries research division. We have managers that work very closely with our research colleagues, and we work closely with the community and the stakeholders. So we have a foundation to tackle these issues moving forward, and as I said, those relationships are important.